Real school nightmares, true horror stories. Story 1. The Phantom Classmate, a shadow in the hallway. It was the middle of the semester when Jason, a 17-year-old high school senior, began to notice something unusual. He had always been the type of student who kept to himself, focused on his grades, and tried to avoid unnecessary drama. His high school days had been mostly uneventful, a blur of classes, tests, and fleeting moments of teenage excitement. But now, a creeping sensation had begun to invade his once ordinary routine. Every day, at precisely 2:30 p.m., as the school's bell rang, signaling the end of the last period before lunch, Jason would hear footsteps. At first, he thought it was simply his imagination playing tricks on him. He had always been somewhat of a loner, walking the halls with his earbuds in, lost in his thoughts. But over the past few days, something about these footsteps felt different, unsettling. They weren't just the usual clatter of students rushing from class to class. No, these were deliberate. They followed him, echoing off the walls with an unnatural rhythm. Jason tried to brush it off as the noise of other students behind him, maybe even one of his friends trying to catch up. But on one afternoon, as he walked down the hallway near the old lockers, the footsteps grew louder and more distinct. He turned around quickly, expecting to see a fellow student, but there was no one there. The hallway stretched out before him, empty and silent, except for the eerie echo of his own footsteps. A chill ran down his spine, his heart rate quickened, and for the first time in his life, he felt a cold wave of fear wash over him. The next day, the footsteps returned. This time, they seemed closer, almost as though someone was walking right behind him. He glanced over his shoulder several times, his skin prickling with the sensation of being watched. Yet there was no one there, just the long, empty hallway leading to his classroom. He reached the door, pushed it open and stepped inside, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled in his chest. But as he crossed the threshold into the classroom, something caught his eye. Standing in the shadows at the far end of the corridor, barely visible through the crack in the door, was a figure. It wasn't clear enough to make out details, but it was there, just beyond his sight, lurking in the darkness. Jason froze, his breath caught in his throat. His classmates were already seated, chatting quietly as the bell rang. But Jason's eyes were fixed on the shadow, his heart thumping violently in his chest. The next few days were a blur of restless nights and an overwhelming sense of unease. The footsteps continued, never missing a day, and Jason couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was following him. His mind played tricks on him, and at times, he wasn't sure if he was hearing things or if it was real. The constant sound of footsteps reverberating through the hallways began to chip away at his sanity. He could feel the anxiety creeping up on him each time he turned the corner, his eyes darting over his shoulder in a desperate search for any sign of life behind him. But there was never anyone there. Only the echo, the distant sound of footsteps that followed his every move. It was in his history class that things began to unravel. Jason had been sitting in the back, trying to focus on the lecture, when he overheard a conversation between two of his classmates. They were talking about the old building on the east side of the campus, the one that was said to be haunted. Jason had heard rumors about the place, of course. Everyone had. It was a story that had been passed down for years. A student had vanished from that building several years ago, never to be seen again. Some said he'd gone missing during a late-night study session, while others claimed he had disappeared after a strange encounter with a teacher. But the rumors didn't end there. Many believed that his spirit still roamed the halls, unable to move on, trapped in the darkness of the school. The more Jason thought about it, the more the pieces began to fall into place. The timing of the footsteps, the shadow in the hallway. He had thought it was just his imagination playing tricks. But now he wasn't so sure. The missing student's name was Derek, and according to the whispers among the students, his ghost was said to wander the school after hours, searching for anyone who would listen to his story. Jason couldn't help but wonder if he had somehow become the next target. Was he hearing the footsteps of Derek's ghost, or was it all just a coincidence? He tried to dismiss the thought, but it gnawed at him. A few days later, Jason decided he needed to confront the situation head-on. He couldn't live in constant fear, wondering if he was being haunted. After school, he ventured to the old building, the one where the rumors had started. It was dark and silent, the building looming ominously in the late afternoon light. Jason pushed open the door, and the air inside was thick with dust, as if no one had been there in years. The hallway stretched before him, eerily quiet, but the hairs on his neck stood on end. He walked down the corridor, each step echoing in the silence. His heartbeat thudded in his ears. The footsteps started again. At first they were distant, almost like they were coming from the end of the hall. But then they grew louder, closer, as if they were walking right behind him. Jason's breath caught in his throat, his legs frozen in place. He turned around, but there was no one there. He was alone. The footsteps continued, unrelenting, as if they were chasing him. Suddenly, he heard a whisper, faint but unmistakable. "Help me!" It came from the shadows, from the very walls of the building. Jason spun around, his heart racing, but the hallway was empty, as if it had swallowed the sound whole. The footsteps had stopped. Jason's mind raced, his pulse pounding in his throat. He had to get out of there. He sprinted back down the hallway, his shoes pounding against the floor as he bolted toward the exit. But as he reached for the door, it slammed shut in his face. The room grew colder, and the whisper came again, louder this time, more urgent. "Help me!" Jason's hand trembled as he tried to turn the knob, but the door wouldn't budge. In a panic, he stumbled back, falling against the wall. It was then that he saw it, a figure standing in the shadows, just beyond the doorframe. It was Derek. His face was pale and gaunt, his eyes hollow with an emptiness that seemed to pierce through Jason's very soul. He was reaching out, his hand almost touching the door, and Jason could hear him pleading, "Help me, please." Jason's heart pounded as he realized the truth. Derek wasn't trying to hurt him. He was trapped, just as the rumors had said. He wasn't a ghost of vengeance, but a soul lost, forever bound to the school. Jason reached for the door again, his hands shaking, but it still wouldn't open. The whispers grew louder, surrounding him like a storm. With a surge of desperation, Jason forced the door open. The world outside was quiet, the air fresh and clear, but his mind was still reeling from what he had just seen. He stumbled into the daylight, gasping for breath, the echo of the footsteps still ringing in his ears. He never spoke about it to anyone, not even his closest friends. But from that day on, Jason couldn't walk the hallways of his school without feeling that chill in the air, that unease that crept in just before 2:30 p.m. The footsteps followed him still, louder at times, softer at others, but they were always there, a reminder that some spirits never rest. Jason would graduate that year, but he would never forget the shadow in the hallway, or the voice that had called out to him from the dark. Some ghosts, it seemed, didn't haunt you to scare you. They haunted you because they needed you to hear their story. Story 2. The Dark Figure at the School Dance. Samantha had been eagerly awaiting her college's annual winter dance for months. At 22, she was finally in her senior year, surrounded by friends, and everything felt like it was falling into place. She had spent weeks preparing for the event, picking out the perfect dress, doing her makeup, and deciding on the right shoes to match her mood. The excitement was palpable. The campus was alive with anticipation, and the event itself promised to be magical, an evening full of laughter, music, and shared memories. Samantha couldn't remember the last time she had looked forward to something so much. As the night unfolded, everything seemed perfect. The decorations were beautiful. The music was just the right mix of energetic and romantic, and she was surrounded by the people she cared about. Her friends laughed, danced, and sang along to the tunes that echoed through the hall. Samantha felt a sense of freedom, of joy, as she swirled around the dance floor, carefree in the moment. It was everything she had imagined, but it didn't last long. It started subtly. A flicker of the lights overhead, a slight dimming of the room that went unnoticed by most. She brushed it off, thinking it was just a technical issue. But as the music played on, she felt a strange shift in the atmosphere. The air in the room grew heavier, colder, and something inside her told her that something was wrong. It was only then that she saw him. A man, standing at the very edge of the dance floor. At first, it was easy to dismiss him as just another attendee, maybe someone who didn't want to get involved in the festivities. But he stood there, unmoving, his figure draped in an all-black outfit, his face hidden beneath the shadow of a hood. The longer she looked, the more his presence unsettled her. There was something unnatural about the way he was positioned, his stillness, his gaze fixed directly at her, and yet he didn't seem to acknowledge anyone else. Samantha tried to push the feeling away, telling herself that she was just being paranoid. After all, this was supposed to be a fun night. But as the evening continued, she couldn't ignore the growing sense that something was terribly off. Whenever she glanced across the room, she would find him standing in the same spot, still watching. The more she danced, the more she felt his eyes on her. She could almost feel the weight of his gaze, piercing through her, making her skin crawl. The feeling didn't subside, and soon, her once carefree spirit had been replaced with an undercurrent of unease. Her friends were too caught up in the revelry to notice her discomfort. Samantha kept her distance, trying to shake off the sensation of being watched, but it was impossible to ignore. With every step she took, he was still there, unmoving in the background like a figure from a nightmare. It was like he was waiting, or perhaps hunting, waiting for her to be alone. By the time the night was drawing to a close, Samantha felt drained, both mentally and physically. She was ready to leave the dance, to escape the oppressive atmosphere that had settled around her. But when she reached the exit, ready to breathe in the fresh air and forget the evening, she froze. There he was, standing just behind her, blocking her path. Her heart dropped into her stomach as panic gripped her chest. How had he gotten there so quickly? She hadn't seen him move. His face remained hidden, but his presence was overpowering, suffocating. Fear surged through her as her mind raced. Who was this man? And why was he following her? She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She was frozen in place, her legs unwilling to move, as though some unseen force was holding her there. And then, just as she thought she couldn't take it anymore, the sound of footsteps, loud and urgent, came from behind her. Someone had seen her. Someone had heard her. It was campus security rushing to her aid. Samantha didn't wait another second. Without thinking, she ran past the security guards who quickly stepped in front of the man, blocking his way. Her heart was racing, her breath shallow, but she didn't stop. She ran to the safety of the nearby building, her mind swirling with confusion and terror. What had just happened? She never saw the man again. In the days that followed, Samantha tried to push the memory of the encounter out of her mind, but she couldn't escape it. The feeling of his presence lingered, haunting her every step, as though his eyes were always on her, waiting in the shadows. The next morning, she went to the campus security office, hoping to make sense of the incident. The footage from the security cameras should have provided some answers, but instead, it only deepened the mystery. There was no sign of the man, no record of anyone fitting his description entering the event. It was as if he had never been there at all. Samantha couldn't believe it. The image of his dark, hooded figure was burned into her mind, but according to the footage, he didn't exist. The unsettling truth began to settle in. Samantha had always been a rational person, someone who believed in the logic of the world around her. But this was different. She couldn't explain what had happened, or why she felt as though the man had been following her for much longer than just that night. It was as if he had always been there, lurking in the periphery of her life, watching and waiting for the perfect moment to make his move. For weeks, Samantha struggled with the aftermath. Her friends reassured her that it was all just a bad experience, something she could move past. But for Samantha, the unease didn't fade. She couldn't shake the feeling that the man, or whatever he was still out there, watching from the shadows. She had no idea who he was, or what he wanted, but one thing was certain. Her night at the dance had been more than just a frightening encounter. It was a warning, one that still haunted her to this day. The dance, the figure, and the lingering fear had left an indelible mark on her, and though she had tried to move on, she couldn't help but wonder, what if the man had been waiting for her all along? What if he was still out there, just beyond the corners of her vision, waiting for the moment when he would emerge from the darkness once again? Story 3, The Locked Classroom, a nightmare you can't escape. Maggie, a 19-year-old freshman, had just transferred to a quiet town, eager to escape the fast-paced chaos of her old life. She was looking forward to her college experience in a place where things seemed slower, more peaceful. At least, that's what she thought when she first stepped onto campus. She had always been a dreamer, imagining college as a time for reinvention and new beginnings. And this small, seemingly tranquil town felt like the perfect backdrop for her fresh start. But she quickly realized that beneath its calm exterior, the school harbored secrets, dark, unsettling secrets that she wasn't prepared for. It all began when Maggie was assigned to room 204 for her history class. The room was located in the oldest part of the building, a long hallway lined with faded lockers and worn-out floors. The building itself had an eerie charm, but there was something about room 204 that unsettled Maggie from the moment she first stepped inside. The air inside was thick, heavy, with a damp, musty odor, as if the room hadn't been aired out in years. The windows were always shut tight, covered with dark, heavy curtains that blocked any trace of sunlight. No matter how many times she walked in and out of that room, the oppressive atmosphere never seemed to leave her. It was as though the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something or someone to happen. She tried to ignore the feeling. After all, she was here to focus on her studies and make new friends. But the unease didn't dissipate. In fact, it only grew with each passing day. It was a strange, creeping sensation, like being watched, like something unseen was lurking just beyond the edges of her vision. Every time she sat at her desk, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with the room, but no one else seemed to notice it. Her classmates laughed, chatted, and focused on their notes, oblivious to the way the air seemed to thicken, to press down on her. It wasn't until one late afternoon, after class had finished and the last bell rang, that things began to unravel. Maggie had stayed behind to finish some work, hoping to get a head start on her assignments. The classroom was mostly empty, with only a few desks still occupied by a couple of stragglers. She gathered her things, packed her books into her bag, and turned to leave, thinking nothing of it. As she reached the door, it slammed shut behind her with an unexpected force. Startled, Maggie whipped around to find the door locked. She tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in. She tried again, more forcefully this time, but it was no use. The door remained firmly shut. At first, she assumed it was just a malfunction, an old, rusted lock that was stuck. But when she turned to look around the room, her breath caught in her throat. The dim lights flickered once, then twice, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. The air, already thick with the scent of mildew, seemed to grow even heavier, pressing down on her chest. The room suddenly felt colder, the temperature dropping as if the walls were breathing out a chill. A strange noise broke through the silence, a faint, almost imperceptible scratching sound. It came from inside the walls, deep within the old plaster. Maggie froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, as if something was trying to claw its way out from behind the walls. Her mind raced, searching for a logical explanation. Was it just rats, or some mechanical issue with the building? But deep down, she knew something was wrong, something far more sinister. She rushed back to the door, banging on it with all her might, yelling for help. But the hallway outside remained silent. She screamed, hoping someone would hear her, but there was no answer. No footsteps, no voices, just the oppressive silence of the building. She looked out through the small glass pane in the door, but all she could see were the shadowy outlines of the hallway. It was as if the entire world outside had been swallowed up by the building. There was no escape, no one to help. Maggie's mind raced, her panic building. The scratching continued, relentless, almost like it was growing closer, louder with each passing second. She tried again to break the door down, using her shoulder to push against the wooden surface, but it wouldn't give. She was trapped. It was then that she noticed something that sent a shiver down her spine. The temperature in the room had dropped drastically. Her breath was now visible, fogging up the air around her. The dim lights flickered once more, casting eerie shadows on the walls. But it wasn't just the shadows that disturbed her. It was what she thought she saw in the corner of the room. A figure. It was fleeting, barely there, but it was enough to make her blood run cold. She froze, staring into the darkness in the corner where the shadows twisted in unnatural ways. The figure seemed to be watching her, moving just slightly, as if it were breathing, waiting. She could almost feel its eyes on her, though she couldn't see them. The figure seemed to blend into the darkness, and before she could react, it vanished. Her head was spinning. What was going on? She looked back at the door, her hands trembling as she fumbled for her phone. She tried to call campus security, but the signal was weak. The call dropped immediately. She felt utterly isolated, as though the room itself was rejecting her attempts to escape. The scratching from within the walls had become a relentless, maddening sound. It was now accompanied by something else, a soft, barely audible whisper. Words that she couldn't quite make out, but felt deep within her soul. Her mind began to break under the pressure. Her heart pounded in her chest, her thoughts clouded with fear and confusion. And then, in a moment of sheer desperation, she made one final attempt to break free. She hurled herself against the door one last time, pushing with all the strength she had left. The door creaked, groaned, and with a final burst of energy, it gave way. Maggie stumbled out into the hallway, gasping for air, her heart racing, her body trembling. She ran, not looking back, her footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. She found herself outside the building, the cold air hitting her like a slap to the face. Her mind was reeling, but there was no time to process what had happened. All she knew was that she had escaped, and she wasn't going back to that room, ever. The next day, Maggie learned the truth. Room 204 had been abandoned for years, locked up after a student had gone missing. According to the rumors, the student had stayed late in the classroom one evening to finish work, but when he didn't return the next morning, a search revealed nothing. No clues, no evidence, just a missing person and a locked room. The whispers in the hallway spoke of strange occurrences, of feelings of being watched. and of students who had felt trapped, just like Maggie. Maggie wasn't the first to feel trapped in that room, and she certainly wouldn't be the last. The building, the room, the whispers, they were all part of something much darker than anyone cared to acknowledge. Room 204 was not just a classroom, it was a prison, and its walls held far more than just dust and mildew. It held the remnants of a lost soul, one that refused to leave, forever waiting in the dark corners of the room, waiting for someone else to feel its grasp. Story 4. The Stalker Who Knew Too Much. Sophomore year had started like any other for Emily, a shy 18-year-old student who had spent most of her first year at school trying to blend into the background. She was quiet, introverted, and content with her small circle of friends. After a tumultuous freshman year filled with self-doubt, Emily had hoped that this year would be different. It was supposed to be her fresh start, a time to become more comfortable with herself, to make new connections, and to feel like she truly belonged. But things quickly took an unsettling turn when she began receiving anonymous notes. At first, the notes seemed harmless enough. They were simple, innocuous messages, compliments about her classes or her appearance. "You looked great in chemistry today," one read, or, "I see you're a fan of the library, huh?" They seemed innocent, and at first, Emily thought little of them. She had no reason to believe that they were anything more than a random act of kindness or a harmless attempt at making a new friend. But as the notes continued, they began to feel more invasive, more unsettling. The notes started to mention things that Emily had never shared with anyone. They knew the places she frequented after school, the quiet park bench by the lake where she liked to sit alone with her thoughts, the small coffee shop she often went to in the mornings before class. How could someone know these details about her life? No one had ever asked. No one had ever shown any interest in those parts of her routine. Emily began to feel uneasy, as though she was being watched, followed by an unseen presence, and the feeling crept into her everyday life. The notes began to delve deeper into her personal life. One day, Emily found a note tucked into her locker. "I know you like to take the bus home every day. It's nice that you walk through the same alley. It's quiet there." Her heart raced as she read those words. She didn't walk through that alley with anyone. It was her private route home, her time to unwind, to breathe in the cool air, to be alone. But now, someone knew about it, and it terrified her. How could they know? She wondered, her mind spiraling. She had told no one about her route. How had they been watching her so closely? The notes continued, each one more specific than the last. "I saw you at lunch today. You had the chicken wrap, didn't you? I like the same thing." The casual tone of the notes made them even more chilling, as if the sender were someone familiar, someone who had been there all along, hiding in plain sight. But it wasn't until the note arrived one fateful day that Emily's sense of safety truly shattered. It read, "I know where you live. See you tonight." The words seemed to echo in her mind, reverberating through her body like a chilling whisper. Her stomach tightened, and the air around her seemed to grow thick with fear. This was no longer some harmless admirer or misplaced note. This was something more sinister, more real. Terrified, Emily confided in her parents and school officials. She was met with concern, but no real answers. The authorities couldn't trace the notes. No fingerprints, no handwriting patterns, no return addresses. There was no evidence, just the notes themselves, and they were as cryptic as they were frightening. The police suggested that it was probably a prank, something from a fellow student trying to get a rise out of her, but Emily knew deep down that this was no joke. The sensation of being watched, the way the notes seemed to follow her every move, couldn't be ignored. This wasn't just an idle prank. This was real. The situation escalated further. One evening, as Emily walked home from school, The familiar feeling of being watched returned. It crept up her spine and her senses heightened. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows. But there was nothing. The streets were quiet, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the sidewalk. She quickened her pace, trying to shake the sense of unease that had gripped her chest. Then she turned the corner onto her street, and there he was, standing at the end of the block, right at the spot where her house was just out of sight, was a man. He was tall, dressed in dark clothes, and his face was obscured by the shadow of his hood. He stood there, motionless, staring at her, his eyes hidden in the darkness. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Her heart thudded loudly in her chest, her breath caught in her throat. This was the figure from the notes, the one who had been watching her from the shadows, the one who knew where she went, what she ate, where she lived. Panic surged through her. She turned quickly, trying to run, but her legs felt like lead. Every step was weighed down by the terror that gripped her heart. She was running toward the safety of her house, but the distance felt endless. She dared not look back, but the sound of footsteps behind her grew louder, matching the rhythm of her frantic breathing. Her mind raced, replaying the note, the chilling words, "See you tonight." Had he been watching her all along, just waiting for this moment? When Emily finally reached her front door, she slammed it shut behind her, her hands trembling as she locked it. She turned to face her parents, her voice shaking as she told them what had happened. Her father called the police again, but by the time they arrived, the man was gone, and there was no trace of him on the security footage. It was as if he had disappeared into thin air, leaving nothing behind but the terror he had caused. For weeks, Emily's life became a living nightmare. She would spot him again and again, always watching from the shadows, always lurking just out of sight. Sometimes it was in the reflection of a store window. Other times, in the corner of her vision as she walked down the street. But every time she turned around, he was gone. The police couldn't find any solid evidence, and the notes stopped coming, as if the sender had vanished. But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, still watching her every move. It wasn't just the fear of being stalked. It was the haunting sensation that someone knew her better than she knew herself. He knew where she went, what she did, where she felt safe. The fear of knowing that someone had been watching her from the shadows, seeing everything she did, changed the way she moved through the world. Every street corner became a potential threat, every reflection a warning. No matter where she went, it felt like she was always being followed, always being watched by someone who knew too much. The police never found out who he was, and the notes stopped, but the scars left behind remained. Emily's sense of safety, once so confident, was shattered, and the shadow of that unknown figure lingered in the back of her mind. It wasn't just the stalker who haunted her. It was the knowledge that, somewhere out there was someone who knew everything about her, but she knew nothing about him. She never stopped looking over her shoulder. And every time she thought she had escaped, the fear whispered back, he was still out there, watching. Story 5. The Haunted Locker, Where the Past Won't Let Go. For Henry, a 20-year-old transfer student, college was supposed to be a fresh start. After leaving behind a small, uneventful town and coming to a new city, he was eager for the opportunities and experiences that awaited him. The campus was vast and filled with promise. A new chapter of his life, far away from the shadow of his past, seemed to beckon with open arms. His dormitory was old, characterized by creaky floors and narrow, dimly lit hallways. But it had a certain charm. It was the kind of place where the walls seemed to hold centuries of stories. But Henry wasn't concerned with that. He was focused on his studies, meeting new people, and adjusting to life in a city that felt like it was always on the move. When he was assigned his dorm locker, Locker 13, located deep in the basement of the building, he didn't think much of it. After all, it was just a locker, right? Nothing special. But the moment he laid his hand on the cold metal door, a shiver ran down his spine. He brushed it off. It was probably just the damp, cold air that lingered in the basement, he told himself. But as the days passed, Henry began to notice odd things happening around the locker. His personal items, books, notes, and even his jacket, things he had neatly stored, would go missing. At first, he assumed he had misplaced them. It wasn't uncommon for students to forget where they placed something in the chaos of adjusting to new routines. But after a while, when he found his things in places he had never put them, on a shelf across the room or wedged under the couch, he started to feel uneasy. The worst part was the locker itself. Every time Henry opened Locker 13, a cold rush of air would hit him. It wasn't the kind of cold you'd expect in a basement, where temperatures remained steady. It was a strange, unnatural chill. And there were times, especially in the late hours of the night, when he could hear faint whispers emanating from the locker. They were barely audible, and at first, he convinced himself it was just the hum of the building's old heating system or the pipes. But the longer he listened, the clearer the whispers became, though the words were still indecipherable, lost in a jumble of distant, fragmented sentences. It wasn't long before Henry's unease turned into obsession. He couldn't stop thinking about Locker 13 and its strange hold on him. After yet another incident where his jacket mysteriously reappeared in the locker, folded neatly as if someone had placed it there with care, Henry felt an overwhelming urge to learn more about the locker. Something about it didn't sit right with him. He began to do some research on the history of the dormitory, hoping to uncover some clue as to why the locker felt different from the others. It was during his search in the library, where old records and yearbooks were kept, that he found something disturbing. The original owner of Locker 13 had been a student named William Billy Harris. According to the old documents, Billy had vanished several years ago without a trace, leaving behind nothing but his unfinished homework, scattered papers, and a note that simply read, "Help me." The police had never found him. No one knew what happened to Billy, and the mystery surrounding his disappearance remained unsolved. The locker had been locked and sealed for years until the building had been renovated, and then it was reassigned to students like Henry. As Henry read the old accounts, a cold sweat dripped down his neck. The whispers he had been hearing, the disembodied voices, seemed to match the timeline of Billy's disappearance. It was as if the room itself had absorbed the energy of his unresolved fate. Henry now understood that the locker was not just a simple storage space. It was a prison, one that trapped the echoes of its past. Determined to put the strange occurrences behind him, Henry tried to avoid Locker 13. He swapped lockers with another student, moved his things to a different part of the dorm, and hoped that the disturbing events would stop. But they didn't. The whispers followed him, growing louder each night, urging him to return to the locker. The temperature in his room would drop unexpectedly, and the items he kept in his new locker would disappear, only to reappear at odd hours, as if some unseen force were playing games with him. And then, one night, the final twist came. Henry was woken by a strange noise at around 3 a.m. He had fallen asleep on the couch in his dorm room, too exhausted from studying to go to bed. The whispers were back. But this time, they weren't coming from the locker. They were coming from the corner of his room, as if someone, or something, was standing just behind him. He turned, but no one was there. The room was still. But the whispers didn't stop. They seemed to surround him, a chorus of fragmented voices growing louder, more insistent. And then, in a sudden moment of clarity, Henry understood. The whispers weren't just trying to get him to go back to locker 13, they were trying to tell him something. The voices were pleading for him to find the truth, to uncover the fate of Billy Harris, the student who had vanished without a trace. Without thinking, Henry stood up, his heart pounding in his chest. He grabbed his coat and left the room, determined to confront the mystery once and for all. The basement was cold and dark, the only light coming from a flickering bulb above his head. As he approached locker 13, his hands shook. He felt as though he were being pulled in, his body against his will drawn to the locker. The whispers were deafening now, a cacophony of voices urging him to open it. With a deep breath, Henry reached for the locker door, and as soon as he touched it, the cold air hit him like a blast. The temperature plummeted, the whispers growing louder, swirling around him. He pulled the door open. Inside, it was empty, save for a single crumpled piece of paper. Henry's hands trembled as he reached for it, the faint sound of a faint sob coming from nowhere, as if the room itself was mourning. He unfolded the paper. It was a note from Billy, unfinished, just like the ones he had left behind before disappearing. The note read, "Help me. I'm still here." Suddenly, the lights above flickered and went out, leaving Henry in pitch darkness. He could hear the sound of breathing, slow, uneven, as though someone were right behind him. He spun around, but there was nothing there. Panic gripped him. He backed away from the locker, his mind racing. The whispers had stopped. Everything was silent, save for the pounding of his heart in his chest. Henry never returned to locker 13. After that night, the campus seemed different, darker, more suffocating. The whispers continued to haunt him even after he graduated. He moved on with his life, but the memory of the locker and the strange presence that clung to it never left him. Locker 13 had a way of latching on to those who dared to open it, leaving a part of themselves behind. And for Henry, it would always be there, lingering, waiting, whispering. The mystery of Billy Harris had never been solved, but Henry had learned something far more unsettling. Some places, some memories, don't let go. And sometimes, the past is never truly buried. It follows you, haunts you, until the day you can no longer tell where the present ends and the past begins. Final thoughts. As we reflect on the stories shared, there's a sobering reality that emerges. It's not the supernatural creatures or the ghosts of old folklore that haunt us the most. It's the real-life experiences, the human encounters, and the places we thought we understood, but which ultimately contain untold darkness. The figures lurking in the hallway, the locked rooms we can't escape from, and the stalkers who seem to know our every move. These are the things that follow us, the unseen terrors that linger long after the light fades. In the eerie silence of these tales, there is a powerful truth. The most terrifying parts of our lives often come from within our everyday world. The shadowy figures that haunt our thoughts aren't always supernatural. Sometimes they're our fears manifesting in the form of someone who knows too much about us, or an environment that becomes a prison we can't escape. The most unsettling aspect of these stories is how closely they mirror our own lives. Whether it's a person who seems to follow us with an intensity that borders on obsession, or a place that once seemed safe, but now fills us with an unshakable dread, these are the true monsters of our world. What do these stories teach us, beyond their ability to send shivers down our spines? They remind us of the importance of listening to our instincts, to trust the gut feelings that tell us when something feels wrong. We live in a world where we are often conditioned to ignore our discomforts, to rationalize things away and dismiss the eerie or the strange. But the truth is that sometimes The things we dismiss can be more dangerous than we realize. There is power in being cautious, in being aware of our surroundings, and in taking the time to reflect on our environments. Whether it's the people we interact with, the spaces we occupy, or the quiet moments of isolation that seem harmless, it's crucial to recognize when things are off. These stories, while terrifying, also serve as a reminder to stay vigilant, to trust our intuition, and to ensure that we don't let fear control us. It's easy to be swept up in the ordinary rhythm of life, but sometimes that rhythm hides the unsettling truth that something isn't right. Moreover, the message these stories convey is one of resilience. Even in the face of fear, the characters within these tales find a way to push through, to survive, and to escape, or at least to make sense of their experiences. This resilience is something we can all draw from in our own lives. Fear, no matter how overwhelming, is a part of being human. What matters is how we face it, how we confront the unknown, and how we use our experiences to grow stronger, more aware, and more compassionate toward others. If you've ever found yourself in a similar situation, whether it's an uncomfortable encounter with someone who seemed to know too much about you, or a place that left you feeling trapped, or even a feeling of being watched, know that you are not alone. These experiences are shared by many, and they are part of the human condition. It's important to reach out, to share your story, and to connect with others who may be feeling the same way. We can only move forward when we face our fears head-on, acknowledging them and understanding that they are a part of the journey, not the end. At the core of these tales is the timeless lesson that fear is not something to be conquered by force. It is something to be understood, embraced, and ultimately learned from. Life doesn't always come with easy answers or immediate solutions. Sometimes we have to live with the uncertainty, with the discomfort, and in doing so, we become stronger. Whether it's a mystery left unsolved or a lingering terror that refuses to go away, we must keep moving forward. The things that haunt us aren't always as powerful as they seem. It is the strength we find within ourselves, the wisdom we gain from our experiences, and the courage to face the unknown that will ultimately help us emerge victorious. So, as we close the chapter on these eerie and unsettling tales, let them remind us not just of the darkness that lurks in the corners of our world, but also of the light we carry within ourselves. We are all capable of confronting the shadows, of unraveling the mysteries, and of finding peace in even the most terrifying circumstances. Just as the bell rings to signal the end of a school day, it's important to remember that we are always moving forward, growing and learning. And sometimes, the most terrifying truths we uncover can lead us to a place of understanding and strength we never knew we had. If you've experienced something similar or want to share your own real-life horror story, don't hesitate to reach out. Who knows what kinds of truths are lurking in the halls of your school or perhaps within your own life? Whatever they may be, remember, you have the power to face them, understand them, and walk away stronger than before. Because sometimes, the scariest things in life are the ones we don't fully understand. But with courage, we can learn to live alongside them and maybe, just maybe, find peace in the process.